it was actually more simple. There were much better things that emerged out of the word of God in this. So here we have the Israelites led in the wilderness of Shur, as it's called, and they are entering a very hostile environment. The temperatures in the summer in the deserts and the wilderness of Sinai can soar to 120 Fahrenheit. That's about 48 degrees Celsius. Now, I've been in temperatures like that, and I tell you, it's merciless. It's painful. Shortly after the 1967 Six-Day War, when Israel was attacked on all sides by every Arab nation, literally attacked Israel on every front, 1967. It was an amazing deliverance of Israel. God's hand was on that nation. And the Egyptians that attacked from the south, many of them fled when the Israelis repelled them through the Gulf of Sinai and through the Negev. And they fled into the wilderness, and there were bodies of Egyptian soldiers found many months later in the wilderness. They hadn't been attacked, they weren't wounded, they literally died of thirst, and they dropped where they were in that area. So this is a hostile environment to take people. So when you sort of think, oh, it's only 3 days, and my goodness, aren't they miserable? Well, with moisture is being sucked out of every part of your body at a rapid rate that you can't refresh it. It's a difficult time for them. It's a time of testing. And God leads them to this bitter experience. Now, one of the patterns you see as we travel through the wilderness with the Israelites is that they go from triumph to trial, from the Red Sea crossing to the bitter waters, from the bitter waters to the wonderful palms of Elim and the springs of Elim, where they camp and they're refreshed. And then they get attacked by the Amalekites, and they moan and they groan and they worry, and then God rescues them. And then they have this triumph over the Amalekites. And then, of course, they miss the food and they start to get hungry, and then God provides them with manna, as Joan was explaining earlier, and quail and meat. Triumph to trial, trial to triumph. It's an amazing experience. We have to learn as Christians that our life is not, as a Christian, is not always green pastures. It's not always, and it's designed not to be always green pastures. The sheep that is talking about the shepherd in Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd. And he says, he makes me lie down by still waters. And you think, what a wonderful thing. And we long, don't we, for those moments of stillness and by those waters where we're refreshed. But the reason that we long for them is because we're also going through times of trial. And, further in that psalm, to remind us, the psalm says, in the presence of my enemies, he prepares a feast for me, but it's in the presence of mine enemies. So we have this kind of dual thing happening. Triumph to trial, feast to fight, mountaintop to valley, light to darkness. And God, through all of these things, is teaching us and testing us. Now, it says the word test in the Old Testament, but actually it's not like we would understand an exam where we get multiple choice and we get it wrong or we get it right to test if we know it or not. What God means by that is teaching us. He's teaching us about how we are, how frail we are often, and how much we can depend on him. And he's teaching us to trust. He's inviting us to trust him. The big lesson from Mara is that God will sometimes allow us or lead us into times of bitterness so that we may experience, and it's in those times of bitterness that he will do something that is lasting. And in fact, it's mostly in those times of bitterness that the lasting impact of his presence in our lives will be felt. And so God reminds them that it's I who led you out of Egypt. It was God that did this. It's not a mistake. It's not a mistake that they turned up at bitter water. He had plan and purpose in this. Because Jeremiah, when Jeremiah was lamenting the destruction of Jerusalem, Jeremiah says in 32:21, you brought your people out of the land of Egypt with signs and wonders, with a strong, you did it. You, Lord God, did it. And an outstretched arm. So why does God lead them when they need water to a place with bitter water? Do you remember the Passover that the Israelites are asked to eat? They cooked the flesh of the lamb. I love lamb. Lamb is one of my favorite dishes. And they're asked to eat with the flesh of this lamb. You can imagine them, the moisture as they stick it in. They eat it in a hurry with the Passover. But they're asked to eat bitter herbs with it, bitter herbs with the nourishment of the lamb. You know, when we often meet people that have been through extreme suffering, we can see the lasting impression of God in their life, can't we? There's nothing really too frothy about them, or even duplicitous or double standards. You can see something of the lasting impression and the mark of God. You know, I met a pastor once from Romania back in the early 90s, and this is as Ceausescu had been disposed of, or deposed, shall I say, and then shot unceremoniously by the Romanian guard. And then basically democracy was just happening all over Eastern Europe. Those of us lived through those times. They were incredible times. We just didn't understand the historic immensity of what was unfolding at the time. But the church in Eastern Europe was liberated from the oppression of the communist regime. It was then free. And this pastor came to London and he met me. I met him at Victoria Station. I brought him home, and then I brought him to a little church down in Haywards Heath called Kent's Road. And he spoke at the communion service. He spoke so softly, and there was a kind of kindness and smiling in his eyes. And I remember how serene he was as he explained how the Nazis had occupied his country when he was a boy. And then he couldn't practice his faith through the communists all those years after that. And there was a man that had been imprisoned for his faith and suffered. And God had done a marvelous work in him. We wish it wouldn't be so, would it? That we would have to go through these times. We don't wish it on ourselves, and we don't wish it on other people. But God brings us to bitterness to test us. And you know, there's one thing that bitterness can do. Bitter circumstances are not meant to make us bitter. Do not let those circumstances make you bitter. You see, the children of Israel, they began to be bitter. You know, it's comic. As you read through Exodus, it is from salvation to tragedy and moaning, grumbling. Now, let's face it, they endured a trial that we probably wouldn't even be able to dream of. So let's put it in perspective. But it is comic because you read through Exodus, the amount of times you hear the word groaning or moaning. And, you know, the option is that when you hit a trial like this is that you groan and you moan. Or you do what Moses did. And what did Moses do? What did the text say? Moses cried to the Lord. So he was going to provide the answer. By the side of every bitter pool is the antidote. He will provide the cure from the infection. That's what we learn from this passage. In Hebrews, the book of Hebrews, it says, see to it that no one fails to obtain the grace of God, that no root of bitterness spring up and cause trouble. Because in the times of trial and testing, we reach out for the grace of God, and the grace of God is always there for us when we're tested and trial in these trials. Don't internalize the bitterness. You know, sometimes bitterness can come through people. And I notice in myself, I harden my heart and I have to stop it. I have to stop. When people are difficult, I find it easier to ignore them. And I get exasperated by people. And God is teaching me, don't harden your heart to people just because it's challenging with what they're bringing or it's difficult. And sometimes we put people on pedestals and they disappoint us. Moses never asked the people to look to him. He asked the people to look to God, and Moses cried to God. He didn't grumble. And God uses the wilderness as a time to school us. It's a time of discipling us. It's a time where we will learn the biggest lessons from him. In Deuteronomy 8, verse 2, it writes, "And you shall remember the whole way that the Lord your God has led you these 40 years in the wilderness, that he might humble you, testing you to know what was in your heart." Often you never really know a person until you've traveled with them in difficult times. Watchman Nee had a wonderful saying. He used to say, Christians should be like Chinese tea or green tea that I've been drinking a bit this week. When they get into hot water, the goodness should come out. But often it's the other way round, isn't it? Actually, when we get into hot water, we get angry, we lash out, we get frustrated, we get bitter. Bitter experiences are never meant to make us bitter. They are meant to make us better, holistically. And sometimes it's only the bitter experiences that are the lessons that we need in order to expel the lessons of the culture, the problems in our own character, the things that we've picked up from other people over the years, the way that culture in us, and it speaks to us so loudly about what it is. And God says, no, don't follow the ways of culture, follow me. And that might be completely opposed. It might look very odd to other people, but you follow me. God had to take this people that had been 400 years living in a foreign land. The grandchildren of Jacob did not know the promises of Abraham. They did not know the land of Canaan. They did not know the ancestry. They did not know the roots. Of course, they kept trying to practice Judaism. But of course, the overwhelming pressure of the culture of Egypt and its gods and its dietary system, its rich foods and its dirtiness would have been in their systems, in their minds and in their culture. And God had to shape them and change them. You notice from the wilderness, he gives them a new diet. The kosher diet that remains now with Jews to this day was invented in the wilderness. A new diet to shape them and change them, because we are what we eat. I learned a lesson this week. The caffeine that I stuff into my body makes me shake. It might give me energy for the time being. We are what we eat. That's why some of you look like chips. No, that's just a joke. So to make sure that you're still listening. And just as much, God has to change that diet. He has to change the way we think. And sometimes it's painful to learn those lessons. Do you know, I learned something about this passage that I found absolutely fascinating when I was studying for this. I read a book called Away in the Wilderness by Jamie Buckingham, and it's a fantastic book. And Jamie Buckingham used to take trips. He took men from America to the desert of Sinai, and he'd give them a wilderness experience. Of course, they were in jeeps, but they would go to the places where the Israelites would have stopped. And he then wrote this book about his lessons from the wilderness. And the word Mara is the word bitter in Hebrew. And he went to these pools. They still exist on the Gulf of Suez. These pools still exist. The water is very oily. But many preachers, often when you hear them talking about the bitter waters, they talk about they're not good for you because they're salty. And that's the way I've always read this passage, that this water is not good for you because it's salty. It's not the case. The water is so enriched with the minerals of magnesium and calcium that it makes the water taste bitter. But actually, magnesium and calcium are the very minerals that the Israelites needed for their arduous journey in the desert. And what's interesting about magnesium is it's a laxative. And God was asking them to drink a water that would be a laxative because it would expel the diseases of Egypt that was in their intestines. You know, they were living on the Nile Delta. The Nile has bilharzia. It's a nasty disease from a parasite in worms and snails. And, you know, I've seen it in Africa, bilharzia. It's on Lake Victoria. And they would have had that in their guts, and it poisons your kidneys slowly. And that horrible laxative would have expelled the amoebic dysentery and the bilharzia and the other nasty things that they would have picked up in the dirtiness of Egypt. And the calcium would have helped their muscles and their bones. You know, athletes who compete at high temperature take a drug called dolomite. Dolomite is a substance that is in this water. It's made of calcium and magnesium, and it enriches the muscles with oxygen, and it helps you think better. And it's got amazing capacity. I started reading some research into dolomite. You have to be careful how you take it, of course. But that God was using this bitter water to do something for them. God invited them to trust. I'm just going to let Zoe in. God invited them to trust him in this bitterness. I think, am I echoing? No, that's okay. And he does something in us lasting, is what we talked about. And he needed those Israelites to take that water, because they actually didn't. They grumbled. And then God then asks Moses to do something different. And growing next to every one of these bitter pools are acacia trees. And acacia sap has a property in it that when it's broken, it would then precipitate with these minerals, and it would make the minerals harden and drop to the bottom of the pool. This guy saw this happening in Marah, and it made the water that was bitter sweet. But it wasn't God's ultimate purpose for them. That generation, if you remember, died in the desert. They took with them a lot of the diseases. They didn't take the bitterness of this pill first, but they could have done. But let me just turn to that piece of wood, that acacia wood that was broken and thrown into the water. You read the passage, and this is where the picture of Christ comes out. Here we have a piece of wood thrown into what is bitter, and he will make it sweet. You know, some people say you're over spiritualizing the Old Testament, but every one of these pictures of the wilderness story is a foreshadowing of what God will do in Jesus. It's a type of Christ. And this wood is an emblem of the cross. You know, we celebrated communion together to recognize that the event that transformed all of mankind, as Alex prayed, was a terrible thing. Jesus asked for this bitter cup to be passed from him. But he then said, yet not your will, not my will, but yours be done. He took on the bitter cup that we would not have to drink the bitterness. And it's him who makes it sweet. And so Moses would have never understood the magnesium, calcium qualities of the bitter water. He would never perhaps have understood the significance of that tree being thrown into the water. But Christ makes all bitter things sweet. The wooden cross is the preeminent symbol of God's provision for us. And it's where he makes us. But God will then take us into trials as Christians. You know, Jesus was baptized. He went through his Red Sea. He was baptized in the Jordan. Then the Spirit led him into the wilderness for 40 days. It's the same picture that we're seeing again repeated in Jesus' life, but he was obedient completely, learned obedience to the Father, and through his obedience, he made us holy. That is the picture of the waters of Marah. It's so interesting that God is asking us to trust him. And then lastly, I know it's getting on, so forgive me. But lastly, God takes them from Marah to Elim. They are at Marah for a time, but they camp at Elim. And what a place to camp. 12 springs representing the 12 tribes of Israel, 70 palms representing the 70 elders. 12 and 70 are the most wonderful numbers that you see repeated again and again and again in the scriptures. And you have this wonderful picture of a palm tree with its roots down deep into the soil, drinking the water. Where are you camping at the moment? You know, I can't help but remember Jesus' words to the woman at the well. You know, he says, you're drinking water that will make you thirsty again, but I can give you water of life that will spring up and be a well of eternal life to you. Where are you camping? God tests us. He has plans in these tests. He often can lead us into testing times. He asks us and invites us to trust him, not grumble, not allow the circumstances to make us bitter. Like Moses, he asks us to cry out to him. And there is always the provision, the antidote, the answer, the solution. And ultimately, it's found in Jesus. Ultimately, it all points to him. We have to learn many lessons ongoing, all of us. We're all on a journey together. We all are frail. Let's recognize we're all frail. And we all must depend on the strength and the promises of God in these times. In Hebrews, he says, endure hardship as discipline. God is treating you as his children. That means that we're sons and daughters, which means an earthly father who disciplined us, God will also discipline us because he loves us. If you are not disciplined, and everyone undergoes discipline, then you are not legitimate, it says in Hebrews. Not true sons. Moreover, we have all had human fathers who disciplined us, and we respected them for it. How much more should we submit to the Father of spirits and live? They disciplined us for a little while as they thought best, but God disciplines us for our good, in order that we may share in his holiness. No discipline seems pleasant at the time, but painful. Later on, however, it produces a harvest of righteousness and peace for those who have been trained by it. Therefore, my friends and fellow pilgrims in the wilderness, strengthen your feeble arms and weak knees. Make level paths for your feet, so that the lame may not be disabled, but rather healed. God's ultimate destiny from the bitter waters is healing, complete healing, healing of mind, of body, and of soul, and of spirit. This is what he leads us to. A time of testing, an invitation for a time of trusting and treating. He will heal us. May God bless the lessons of the wilderness to us. Over to you, Richard.